With an incoming tide, you don't get much flow, which is why the floating heads actually, people that was using a floating head in an incoming tide, you could still get enough swing to get the fish actually interested in your flies because you were still swinging. And the fish would move some distance. I mean, me and Brian started playing with like foam flies and floating flies that you could pop near the surface, and you could actually see fish charge at your fly from about 15 feet away, big bow wave your fly. And we're talking like 30, 40 pound fish doing this. It was really good fun.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spey fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska. Thank you for joining us today. We have a fun show planned with an international crew of fly tyers, including Stuart Foxall, Eric Leininger, and Scoot Mason. These three characters have a wealth of angling experience to share with you. We're going to be talking food source fly design, new and effective mending strategies, productive fly presentation, innovative topwater techniques for king salmon, and how do you best turn steelhead bites into hooked fish. So lots of stuff coming your way today. It's time to get in the bucket. Welcome to an episode I've been looking forward to for a while. I've got three of my absolute favorite fly tyers with me today. We're talking to Eric Leininger, Craig Scoot Mason, and my good buddy Stuart Foxall, all the way from England. So let's start with you, Eric. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
I'll keep it short and sweet. Basically, I reside in Oregon City, Oregon, with my two dogs that are in here, and I work at Northwest Fly Fishing Outfitters last 9 years, and I love to fish. I mean, that's my thing. Terminal tackle, fly, whatever. Really like instructing. Don't really like classes, which is kind of a little bit of a oxymoron or whatever the word to describe that is. But when I get on the water, I do like the fact that you can kind of turn people from their prior skill level to advanced one. So that's pretty rewarding in the job. And I'm stoked to be on the podcast as well. I met you many years ago on the Bulkley when I saw my first Watermaster, and you did a TED Talk basically on it. I was there till dark, learning about all things Watermaster, and ended up getting one. And that's what I actually learned to row on. So it's come full circle now.
Right on. Scoot, what do people need to know about you?
Well, I'm Craig Mason, also known as Scoot. I live in Squamish, and unlike these other two fellas, I just fish and tie flies and kind of hang around the river as much as I possibly can. Mostly on the spey and mostly chasing steelhead.
Stuart.
I'm Stuart Foxall. I'm from the UK. I've fished for nearly 50 years, do a lot of fishing around the world. I've designed a bit of tackle for a company and designed some flies for Aquaflies. So, and last year I was guiding in Iceland.
Right on, Stu. Well, you and I have known each other a while. I think our meeting was detailed quite nicely in a previous episode of Wet Fly Swing that you did with Dave. And I have to tell our listeners once again that the three guys I'm talking with today, if I could get a fly from each of you, I'd be real pleased. These are my three favorite fly tyers when it comes to steelhead fishing. And Stu, you and I have done some steelhead fishing, but we've also fished in Alaska. And you've actually done a fair amount of guided fishing all over the world. So I'm really curious to hear about your transition now to actually being a guide and working in Iceland. What is the biggest surprise to you from being a client to being a guide in the job?
I've really tried to, as you know, I've been guided by some of the world's best in my opinion. So when I started to guide, I thought about all the best bits that I like from certain guides and just tried to do exactly the same thing. And the one thing that I did pick up from some of the best guides is a lot of the job is actually man management. It's not so much catching lots of fish. It's trying to gauge what each individual person wants to get from out of their day on the river. And sometimes it's just to be out there and enjoy the actual fishing for whatever their take on fishing is. For some people, it's just casting a fly out nicely. Every now and again, they might get lucky. Some of the guys want to catch every fish in the river, which that's a bit harder to do.
Well, you've got, let's see, you probably have 10, maybe 15 years experience in Alaska as a client, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the Connectoc and the Aurolic, correct?
Yeah.
Well, you probably know this, but Eric has spent a fair amount of time guiding in Alaska himself. Eric, whereabouts were you guiding in Alaska?
So I was in Southwest Alaska, about 430 miles southwest as the crow flies in the Kuskokwim drainage, although it was weird. The Good News doesn't actually drain into the Kuskokwim Bay, but that's what we're categorized as. But yeah, I guided on the Good News River for Good News River Lodge, the Gorton family, for 9 seasons, 6 of them full, and then the remaining seasons kind of would come in and do some video and some filming during Kings, and then come back and guide Silvers until mid-September, so August and September. And then stop doing that. The last year I did that was 2019.
Would it be fair to say that you're retired from Alaska guiding, or do you think you'll go back?
I mean, 99.9%. I could get into the whys of that, but to each their own. For me, the long and short was I just couldn't get better. And that's not like, oh, you're fucking fantastic. It's just there's so many fish up there. And not to digress, but people don't really want to learn how to get better in Alaska. I would say the majority of people up there are numbers people, even if it's king fishing. So they don't want to learn how to cast better or present the fly better. It's just like put the fish on the end of the line type of thing. Now you do get the anomaly and you get the person out there that's like, hey man, I'd love to get better this week. I saw it, I don't know, a couple times in 9 years. As a guide, I wasn't doing myself any favors. I wasn't challenging myself or getting better at anything. I was just like, we used to joke, it's like boat driver, water watcher, fish netter. Like that's your job up there. So it was a bit boring just seeing after so many fish, you get kind of dull to it and you're looking to try to do different stuff. And different stuff is usually a harder way to catch fish and people weren't interested. So it just, it's a lot of work, which I don't mind. The pay's not great. I'll throw that out there. Pro tip, here you go. Anybody that wants to work in Alaska, talk amongst yourselves, find people that have guided there and apply at only the lodges that pay the absolute most. The place where you're going to make the absolute most money possible, because spoiler alert, it's the same job at any lodge. You could be at my old lodge. You could be at Katmai Trophy. You could be at whatever, the Orvis endorsed lodges. And when you go up there, you're thinking, oh, I want to go to the spot with the best runs or the brightest fish or the closest to the ocean or, this X and Y of the fishery that makes it enjoyable. You're wrong. You're going to be doing the same thing, whether you're catching kings 50 miles upriver that are, fire truck red, or you're catching steelhead right out of the mouth, out of the Sandy or something, one of those little tributaries. The first couple months, you're like, this is the best. And then you're just like, okay, it's cool, but how much am I making? And the answer is not a lot if you pick the wrong lodge. So that would be my advice, is just, you're going to learn the same skills. The difference is, are you going to have a livable wage when you get back? Because you probably don't have a place to live because you've been gone for 4 months. You definitely don't have a job because you've been gone for 4 months. You're mostly single because you've been gone for 4 months. And so when you got that nest egg of hopefully 20 grand or more, kind of softens the blow a little bit, takes off the edge, right? I did not get that. So I'm not going to go into specifics, but let's just say you'd basically have money for a month and then you better start working again because they go fast.
I think, my experience in Alaska is limited to the Connectoc and the Aurolic, and mostly the Connectoc and primarily fishing for king salmon, a little bit of trout fishing, but primarily fishing for king salmon. What I saw at Alaska West was an interesting mix of veteran guides and people who were just going to do it 1 year for the experience. And you talked about it in a previous podcast I listened to, Eric. We'll put it on the show website, your previous episode with Dave, because it's a great episode. You give some really good advice to a prospective new Alaska guide about the start of the season and what to expect. I think part of the allure of guiding in Alaska is the access to the fishery, being there for the whole season. But from what I heard, and I could be wrong, but from what I heard, the beginning of the season prior to guest arrival is a little bit of a sufferfest, because you show up to to the place and camp's not set up, and that's going to be your thing. And it's probably, if it's not snowing, it's probably trying to, or it's raining really hard. And those first couple weeks are really character building. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And, the reason I say those things isn't to bash on any lodges or their program and stuff, but it kind of is. Yeah, you're going to work your tail off. You are going to be so tired by the start of the season that you're already broken. You're a shell of a human being. And you're like, cool, I haven't even started my job. You're not going to make any tip money. So you're just making per hour. Don't do the math on that. Don't sketch out how much you're making an hour, because it's way below minimum wage and you're working harder than you've ever worked before. Disregard if you know how to do it. Oh, haven't framed a house before? Disregard. Haven't done plumbing? Guess what? You're a plumber now. Never turned a wrench? You're a mechanic. So, and all of those things. Now, I didn't know how to do any of them. Still don't. So I was pretty useless. I was like painting and fucking carrying shit, basically. I mean, I just look. And honestly, that's how you want to go in. Pro tip number 2, when applying to a lodge, don't tell them you've ever built anything. If you're a carpenter, don't say that. You are a cotton candy specialist. You are a dog manicurist. Anything that they can't be like, oh, that's skills we can utilize. I am a cardboard recycling artist, whatever. So don't do that. When you apply to a lodge, you are now in school until the second week, at least, of June. You have 4 kids that you can't leave until the second or third week of June. You're having surgery and you're not going to recover till the second or third. You're not available from May through the second week of June. And, they're going to say, oh, you're going to fish all the time. You're going to be able to do all this cool stuff. Kind of. But guess what? There's no fish in the river. There's trout. Yay. And after you catch your 20th of those, the first day out, you're like, I am cold and tired. So, yeah, I think lodges should be more honest with people coming up, being like, hey, you're going to work your butt off. For that preseason, we're going to pay you $25 an hour. Then we're going to back it off when you start guiding. Because you do it once and you're like, I got hustled. Like, that's how I felt. I was like, I got completely hustled. And I like the owners and I like everybody that I worked with at the lodge, but I'm like, just be honest, be like, hey, it's rough, but like what you're going to do is you're going to see how the lodge is working. You know where stuff is at the shop. You know how the kitchen's set up. You know the personalities of the people you're working with. Don't talk to Jeff before 8 p.m. Don't talk to Mike after 8 p.m. You figure out these things to do and not do, which is super helpful to have a season where it's flowing a little bit more easily. That would be a bonus for them to highlight, pay people appropriate, or just pay contractors to come up and pay them the right amount of money.
You talked about pay, Eric. Is the pay between lodges, is there a huge variation between the different lodges?
Giant. I mean, here we go. Some inside information. When I started there, and again, have really good relationship with the owners. They run a great lodge still. The money has gone up. It's kind of coming to the 21st century, whatever. I'm just saying, whatever, 13 years ago, whatever it was, 14 years ago. And I think it was that had more to do with the way the owner, because the owner had guided there previously, which is hats off to Mike. That's crazy. You work there and then you end up owning the lodge, and he's a terrific human being. So if you're looking into doing the Alaska thing, which I think is a great way if you want to guide, you get tons of hours, tying knots, reading people, reading water, it's being able to see through water, notice, weather trends, paying attention to how fish move at different water levels or whatever. All that stuff soaks in. It gives you a lot of data feedback and it gets you a lot of days on the water. So I think everybody should do it that wants to guide. You're going to get some interesting clients.
I think I heard you say previous, Eric, sort of trying to compare your first guide season in Alaska to like a military boot camp. You're just immersed in it, and you're either going to come back early crying or you're going to come out of it a seasoned guide in a very short time because of the physical and mental trials that you get put through. Here's the quick little point I want to make to people listening, and that's guiding is a noble profession. Sometimes people think it's something just kids do for a year, but it's a noble profession, and there's a difference between great guides and an okay guide. There really is, and that difference is vast. And you've outlined it just a second ago, so I won't get into it. But Stuart, you've now on both sides of this, and Scoot, you've never been a guide, but you've certainly been a client. I think that it's important for lodge operators to understand that what brings the clients back isn't necessarily the fishery, but it's actually the guide, because a good guide will add so much to your day, whether it's casting tips, knowing what type of bird just flew by, or the name of the mountain over there, or what type of tree that is. A good guide will take a tough day fishing wise and turn it into a wonderful day. One of the things about Alaska, I think, as a guide or as a person just fishing there, that's great, is there are so many fish that for people who want to develop technique and tackle, and especially flies, it's a really fantastic testing ground. Stuart, I've been very fortunate to fish with you in Alaska, and I feel like in some cases I got to be early in on some of your newest patterns. What have you learned in your time in Alaska, especially pertaining to king salmon, about flies and how that can equate to fish on the line?
As you know, when you stopped hosting up there, I sort of stepped in. So I'll go back to what Eric was probably saying. I was going out with clients during the day and helping them with the casting and the fishing. And to be honest, because I was there, Eric, the clients we had actually, and Brian will say the same, that was actually very interested in learning new techniques and doing different stuff. So we were quite lucky in that respect. But also on the night times, it was tying flies. So I'd be tying flies all night as well with clients so that they could go out and catch a fish. There was bloody long days. So, I mean, doing 2 or 3 weeks, which I was doing in Alaska, of doing that, you can see there I was bald as a coot. That's where it sort of happened, because that was bloody long days. And that was with nice people as well and having good fishing. So, but going back to your question, Ryan, the one thing that I did realise pretty quickly with fly design there was you've got to tie fairly light flies, because a lot of people just cannot cast heavy flies. So you've always got to think about what profile you want out your fly, which is one thing, what depth you want your fly to be at, which is another thing. But the biggest thing that I found out with doing commercially tied flies was people have got to be able to fish them, because if they can't cast them, they won't fish them. And guess what? If they don't fish them, they don't catch fish.
Stu, when it comes to a king salmon fly, if you had to only fish one fly, what would it be?
One of those biggish intruders, aquaflies actually do now, with a big comb. So lots of flash, lots of mobility, pretty light to cast. And as well, part of the reason that we were using such big flies on the Connect Talk at the time was there were that many chum salmon. If you used anything smaller, you'd have a chum salmon every cast.
Eric, in your podcast with Dave, you told a great story about, let's call it a development in tackle that you came up with that really increased your success rate. And I think a lot of anglers, Scoot and Stu, maybe you've had this experience fishing for salmon. We feel that because our sink tip is a T14 or whatever, and we threw a mend in, that we're down deep. But the reality is that we're still very close to the surface, and our fly isn't slowing down and doing what we think it's doing. Eric, I know you went into great detail in that story in that previous episode. But I would love for you to touch on it and talk a little bit about, depth and how that might impact fly choice.
Yeah, that was, probably quite possibly at least for swinging flies, the biggest, I guess, knowledge bomb, or whatever you want to call it, that has helped me in my guiding and my fishing. I mean, I think about that moment all the time, at least, weekly in the wintertime. But long story short, I did some drone footage of guys swinging for kings, and, they're fishing like a chartreuse and white fly. You could see it really well, sunny day. And fish are rolling. A couple guys caught a couple right off the bat, and then just blank fest, just fly swinging. So I got a little lower. You could actually see the fly, and that's it. So when you're fishing any sink tip, you're not going to mend it if you do it the old up and over trout style. A lot of guys let go of their two-handed rod, which makes sense, right? Two-handed rod, just use one hand. That makes sense. That's sarcasm. So they just let go and go flop. So their Skagit is now at a 45, but their sink tip is at a 90, and their fly is pretty much upstream. So it sinks like this, and that's how it sinks. And so when it comes under tension, and here's the fish, your fly comes down, comes under tension, it goes past them, and then in the inside, it starts tracking slow, and most people would think, oh, when that fly comes under tension, it's going to come up in the water column. I used to think that. It doesn't. It continually sinks with a sink tip. That's just what it does. The tension doesn't seem to affect it. It's tungsten, so unless you're fishing really fast water, which you shouldn't be, it continues to sink. So you've heard me say it a million times. That's why most people say, oh, I catch steelhead, any anadromous fish or swinging that last third of the swing. And that is because, you guessed it, that's the only time your fly's fishing. So we work the next day, and that's a whole story, but basically same setup, couple Brits, good spay casters, fished everywhere, caught fish, caught a couple right off the bat. Fish are rolling everywhere. Now it's dark and cloudy and windy. It's like, oh, dude, we should be railing, and nothing. So we basically spent an hour or so casting further than where we want the fly to start swinging, lifting the rod with both hands and yanking it upriver, not so much towards us, but that 13 or 13.6 rod, having it way out, lifting and pulling. And you can see that stuff, I call it turn the corner. It turns and comes back upstream. So everything's in a straight line. And maybe 3 or 4 feet over here is where I think the furthest fish is sitting out. So we cast over here, big pullback. It comes upstream a little bit. You drop your rod tip. That allows that fly to sink in a straight line, the fly followed by the tip and the Skagit, come tight and have no acceleration. It kind of activates all that marabou and shit. It's just doing this, and then it comes tight and just starts working and slowly tracks. The amount of fish you're going to get within the first couple seconds of your swing goes up 1,000%. If there's a fish there, it eats it. It's like when you're pulling plugs and you're on hook and that tip's rocking, and you lift the anchor from the boat and you start drifting down and the rod comes up and the whatever plug comes up. You drop the anchor, scope catches, rod gets reinforced with the current. That plug jams back down and starts working. 99% of the time, that's when we got our eats in Alaska, plug fishing. They see it. It's just annoying. And then it kind of comes up and they're like, oh, that's weird. And then just in their face, just going nuts. So between seeing the plug stuff work, seeing the drone footage, it was kind of obvious. It's like, man, we suck. Like, we're not doing anything out here. We're just hucking this wizard fucking staff and hoping that we catch a fish, right? It's not going to work. When he started doing that, we started putting up pretty big numbers the rest of the season and going forward. Took that back to winter steelheading. Now people refer to it as the mega mend or whatever. And the downside to that is you've got to learn how to cast further. The people are like, oh, 50, 70 feet, that's fine. It is if you're fishing a river that's no more than like 5 feet deep. You're going to be able to get that fly there. There's not going to be any crazy buckets on the far side. One of the rivers I fished, the Clackamas, it's notably very hard to catch a fish there. Most of the fish there's a couple runs that they'll be in that 2 to 5 feet of water, but most of the fish are sitting in like 8 to 12 feet. It's just deep parts, but they swing really nice, but you got to get that fly down. So between those theories, I started building my own custom sink tips that clients can't fish that well. A couple of them can. They go from T8 to T11 to T14. You throw them on a fist head that goes from floating to intermediate to sink 3. So your swing is now like this. And so when you do that technique and get the fly to the surface, when you drop your fly, T14 and your fly is dropping, followed by T11, T8, all that stuff. When it comes tight, your fly swings like this instead of a level sink tip. So you're deep way out there, but the benefit is when you come into the inside and there's a nice boulder that a fish is sit behind, the level stuff wants to hang up on it, right? But this just goes over the top. So you can fish shallow with it and you can fish the deep stuff on the outside. It's not for everybody. It definitely takes some figuring out and learning how to drive your fly through there. Side note, somebody gave one of those sink tips away. I've told this story a million times, and Rio made them triple density sink tips. Shocker, they did a crap job. They made the sink tip the same color, black. Great. So how much of it is S2 and S3 and F5? And if that little tiny writing that nobody can see gets worn off like the first cast that I do, then how do I know what it is if I don't put it in the pack? Like, who'd you guys run this focus group by? Because clearly they don't fish. You already have the color-coded stuff. It's the only thing that I like for Rio is the teeth stuff.
It's interesting you bring that up, Eric. So in the early 2000s, I was doing some stuff with a tackle company that Stu's familiar with called Loop. And at this time, Krister was the owner, and Krister loved a good new idea, almost to a fault. And I presented to him this idea of, I won't call it Skagit because we weren't using that term as much back then. We tended to use Scandinavian style lines, but they were overweighted. And it was a graduated thing where the back end was floating and the front end was type 3, or with the big chunk of intermediate. And then you would take a sink tip like you designed, and you could put that in front of that and do exactly what you just said. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And Stu, I'd love for you to jump in here in a second with some of the tackle that UK anglers might have used, say in a place like Norway. What I saw in Alaska when I was there is people trying to sometimes fish full sinking heads, and they're hard to spay cast, almost impossible to spay cast for obvious reasons. And they would end up overhead casting them. But when they got that thing in the water, and if they did the mega mend that you described, Eric, where everything's kind of presenting in a straight line there and allowing it to drop down into the fish, man, what a fishy setup that is. But, once again, we come back to this idea of, I think generally speaking, regardless of the fishery, people's flies are a lot closer to the surface than they imagine them to be. Stu, let's have you jump in here for a second and talk a bit about, we're still in the realm of king salmon, but what's your setup on the Connect Talk look like? Connect Talk's not as deep as the Good News. What are you fishing there for lines?
Generally, I've actually preferred to fish a floating Skagit head, simply because I could mend it and I was in more control than a sinking Skagit head. And we were just using T14 tips. But the one thing, Eric, that we used to do as well was fish the tides. And obviously with an incoming tide, you don't get much flow, which is why the floating heads, actually, people that was using a floating head in an incoming tide, you could still get enough swing to get the fish actually interested in your flies because you were still swinging. And the fish would move some distance. I mean, me and Brian started playing with like foam flies and floating flies that you could pop near the surface, and you could actually see fish charge at your fly from about 15 feet away, big bow wave your fly. And we're talking like 30, 40 pound fish doing this. It was really good fun. A lot of the fish you used to lose, some that you didn't lose by the time you'd landed it, the tide had turned, so you'd lost your opportunity to get more fish. But it was really good fun, really memorable.
Yeah, that's cool. After my first year in Alaska, every time the tide would push in and choke the river, everybody would go upriver to find a little bit more current. And the head guy at that time, Jeff Arnold, I'd always see him pass me going into tide water. And I'm like, what the hell? You can't swing down there. So it's like towards the end of the second season, or the end of the second king season, when I'd see him pass me, I just would turn around and follow him, which he loved. So I'd see him down there, and he's like way at the tip of the bay where it's pushing, and we can row those John boats, and he's back rowing going up the river, like slowing his boat down, but it's pushing him upriver. And his dudes are throwing single hand floating lines, floating tapered leader, and pretty big, lightly weighted flies. And he just would fish this color change. And I saw him rail. And I was like, guess what? I'm getting in there. So slid right in, kind of saw what he was doing, hooked it up the same way. And that was kind of our program that I learned / stole from him. And it was the same thing, there was such little current that you couldn't swing. Also, we'd have two guys. We fished a lot from the boat. So it worked really good. I mean, you're basically like streamer fishing for trout, but you're in tide water it was so weird going back towards the lodge, but back rowing. And they would just roll on this change. And I mean, your flies were 6 inches below the surface and they're just crushing, which is a really fun thing to do.
Yeah. But that's what we were sort of playing with. And I think we got it fairly dialed, didn't we, Brian? Because some days you get, on each tide, you get 15, 20 fish each on a tide, literally within an hour or two. It was really good. But can you remember the year of salmon camp, Brian? So basically, it was a high water year, which was very unusual for the Connectoc. And a bank of tundra had broken down. So the river was as dirty as hell, which is very unusual for the Connectoc. But the first run above the landslide was called Salmon Camp, and it was just basically a slough, and every single salmon that was running was pulling into salmon camp, and they were just stacked on top of each other. And the one thing that I immediately saw was the people that was using the usual heavy gear was actually swinging below the fish. So I'd stuck on floating head, motive, and one of these foam flies, and literally it was 2.5 feet of T14. And I think in the first morning that me and Aussie Pat was fishing, I think we ended up landing 30 odd fish between us in 2 hours. And then I didn't get back to fish there for the fortnight until the final day. And I was given the final hour, and I went in and I had 9 Chinook in 9 casts. And the last one snapped me. A number of these fish was like £40 plus. The last one snapped me, and I just walked up to I'd got about half an hour of the trip left. I just walked back up to the boat, grabbed myself a beer, sat in the boat, and like Spencer was the guide. Spencer was like, "Aren't you going to get back in?" And I was like, "Spencer, I'm not going to beat that 9 fish in 9 casts. Nope, I'm just happy." But you could see the fish bow wave and turn on your fly because you was only a foot deep at maximum. And everybody else that was going in, because I was fishing the heavy stuff, they'd probably get 1 or 2 fish each pass of this run. It was quite incredible to see. Nobody had changed.
Stu, and this is, it's important for people listening to understand that this is not normal Chinook fishing. This was an anomaly that was created by, a set of conditions. And I heard you mention Aussie Pat. Shout out to Aussie Pat. He's a good buddy of ours. Scoot, I think you attended his wedding, didn't you?
I did. He got married in Hawaii. And so his now wife, Jordan, is from San Fran, and he's obviously from Oz. So I didn't know this, but a lot of Aussies, when they do North America, they'll stop in Hawaii on the way home. So naturally, his wedding was Hawaii. And I thought, it's a bit brave to invite 100 people all the way to Hawaii. I don't know if you guys have been. Hawaii is not very cheap. So we went down to Hawaii anyways. And obviously, Aussie Pat is a big, big fisherman. So fishing was on the menu a little bit on the wedding. So he went down. He actually got there early and did a couple days. We all wanted to do bonefish. Obviously, the bonefish in Hawaii are the biggest on the planet. And bonefish is quite a target species. So Pat went down early, and he did really well. And we went down and met him, and we had his stag party. Me, him, and another guy, Harrison, that I know a couple of you guys know. Shout out to Harrison. We went out for a stag party and dressed Pat up in a pink tutu and a pirate costume. And we went bone fishing on the flats in Hawaii for a day and had an absolute epic day chasing those things, which is, that in itself is an incredible fishery. I don't know if you guys have done it.
Do you think Aussie Pat would mind if we put that photo of him with his tutu on the website supporting the show?
That's one of the best things about Aussie Pat is there's no shame in his game. So Pat won't mind at all.
So Eric, you got to understand, I don't think you've met Aussie Pat. This was this kid, and he was a kid then. He was a young guy. Your average age of a guest in Alaska is probably over 50 for sure. And he was early 20s, if I remember. His first time Chinook fishing, he goes to salmon camp. So this is, he goes to the exact conditions that Stu just explained, where these fish were, it was like a funnel. They got drawn into this thing, and the top end of this channel was almost a dead channel. There was just a little bit of water at the top. So they were just stacked in there like cordwood, rolling around. And this is his first experience fly fishing for Chinook salmon. Amazing, he's still at it, and he loves all types of fishing. But talk about lucking into something, eh? What a day or what a morning that would have been for him to see all those 30, 40-pound fish rolling in this silly side channel.
How deep were those fish resting in the slough? And I guess going back to you, Stu, why were they so active?
They were anything from 1 foot to 10 foot deep, depending on where they were in the trench. But I think it was just that there were so many fish just stacked up. And I mean, literally, there must have been hundreds, if not even thousands of fish just in this room. And maximum in there, you could get like 4 people in there.
So let's, we talked about some foam booby almost style flies for Chinook, but I don't want to waste the opportunity to have 3 great fly tyers here. And you guys got to understand, I have literally not tied a fly in over a decade. It used to be a big part of my life. For whatever reason, I just haven't tied a fly in a long, long time. So Scoot, Stu is, a bit of a hero to a lot of us. And I think I think he's influenced your particular tying. Why don't you tell people listening how you got into fly tying and why they should pay attention to what guys like Stu and Eric are doing. And also, you're a guy that is a little bit of a secret. You've got some of the, I would say, the most interesting steelhead flies out there, but you can't buy them from a store. The only way you get one is trading you for something.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in there to unpack. I guess we start in the beginning. You said you haven't tied in a decade, and I believe you. And the last one you might have tied might be here in my house. When I learned to tie, that was when you had the shop in Whistler. And as a lot of us do, I think you get into fishing for salmon. And when you get on a spey rod, I think the natural thing after that is you want to catch one on something that you've tied. And so, two-handed chasing steelhead and salmon becomes quite addictive. And so it also becomes quite obsessive, especially steelheading. And I think the fly tying thing hit me like that as well. So Stu, my style is I learned from Stu. Stu had some flies in your shop on display, and I actually took some courses with Stu. But when I learned how to tie, Stu had a bunch of hand-tied intruders. You kind of had all the commercial flies, and then there was a little display in the shop, and Stu had some of his custom intruders. And I wanted to learn to tie, and I bought all the gear. I bought the vise, and I made you show me, Brian. You showed me the first. You tied with me, and you tied a fly, and I tied it. And I remember we did it right there in the shop, and I finished tying the fly, and I kind of looked over at Stu's intruders, and I went, okay, I've got a little bit of a ways to go here. What we tied, no offense to you, Brian, looked nothing like those intruders. So I kind of got obsessed and went down the rabbit hole, and I just wanted to learn and watch all these videos. And I was lucky enough that at that time, Stu did a couple tying classes, and I did some classes with him. So I guess my intruder style is kind of definitely stylized after Stu's. I love Stu's styles of intruders and his prawns, his potbelly pigs and stuff like that. And so my style is a lot based on Stu's. But after I kind of got, maybe a year into tying, and I learned, all the techniques and stuff like that, I kind of veered off a little bit. Like the prawns are a very big pattern. Stu's prawns are awesome. And I know that there's a little bit influenced by Mikey, who's another Squamish guy. Shout out to Mike Urlovsky, who ties sick prawns. And I was kind of fascinated with them. And then I just kind of went down the whole food source. So I know that steelhead in particular, they're not eating when they're in the river. But when you're tying a fly, and whether it's you talk about the mega mend or line techniques or fly choice, I think you want to up the odds the best way possible. So I kind of veered off and started tying patterns that look like food sources. Even though they're not eating, it's kind of like, if you're driving down the highway and you see a billboard for a Big Mac, even though you're not hungry, you kind of want one. So it's that kind of thing. So I started tying a lot of stuff that was food source, whether it was prawns or squids or bait fish. And that's kind of where the road I went down. And that's still kind of a lot of the stuff that I fish to this day. I know it's a long-winded way around it, but that's how I got there.
So the first pattern that you had that really caught my attention, I believe you called it the Squid Pro Row. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we settled on that name. Yeah, that was a pattern that I kind of developed. And I kind of was like asking why I didn't see a lot, kind of 10 years ago of people were fishing, like intruders were huge, and it was just flies that didn't really mimic food sources. And 60% of a steelhead's diet in the ocean is squid. And so I kind of went down and did a squid fly and spent a couple of years kind of, I guess, honing that design in a little bit. And that was when swim tanks were kind of first all the rage. And I built a bit of a swim tank, a homemader, and would swim the squids in there and on the river, and just kind of dialed that in. And yeah, that was a pattern that still kind of works very well for me.
What I love about your flies is they seem to be kind of like constantly in development, and you sort of evolved them over time. Take a minute here and describe to the people listening, if you don't mind, what a Squid Pro Row looks like.
So, I mean, the people out there listening, they can't see it, but basically squid fly is like very similar. If it's similar to another fly, it's probably a rubber-legged intruder. So it's got two stations, but you don't need the hollow middle section as you do an intruder. I fill that with dubbing. So basically the back station is going to be rubber legs, And then the thing that makes it unique is the eye placement and how the eyes are placed. So if products have kind of come a long way, where like if you're doing prawn eyes, you can get eyes made. But when I started, I would make prawn eyes myself, and I would just burn, a 40-pound piece of mono into a ball, and then you can kind of paint it with a nail polish or a varnish to your liking. And so I was doing those for prawn eyes. So basically, it's the same thing. You take forget the company's name, but they make those squid eyes. And I would get those squid eyes, and basically you just take some mono and you burn the end of the mono so that it becomes tacky and it becomes adhesive, and stick those prawn eyes onto it. So you've got a backstation is going to be like rubber legs, and then you're going to have these squid eyes kind of hanging back about the same level as your slapping that you're going to wrap as a collar. And then you've got a middle body of dubbing, and that's going to kind of give you the body color that you want the squid to be. And then you're going to wrap with some marabou and then just a bit of schlappen on the front station. And that's going to give you kind of the most realistic, at least that I've found, swimming and looking squid in the water.
What I love about that pattern, I don't know if you're still doing it this way, but the ones that I've been able to get my hands on was the use of white with a little bit of purple, creating a really interesting translucent effect. I think personally, white flies are underutilized. They always seem to be real fish getters for myself.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I fished that white a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I fish I know that white is kind of more of they say it's more of a winter fly, but I fish a lot of white stuff in the summer too, and it always works really well.
Eric, I was lucky. A couple years back, you showed up at the lodge with a little gift for me, and I really appreciated it. And I still have some of those. It was a hard to sort of pigeonhole fly. It certainly wasn't an intruder. It looked a lot like a prawn. It definitely looked like it was a squid. And it wasn't white, but it was quite a pale fly. And I'll tell you, those things with a little bit of orange out the back have been really productive for me. Can you do your best to describe, if you don't mind, to people what that fly looks like and its importance? Is it something you still use?
Yeah. So, my first year up at the lodge, people are like, oh, that kind of like shrimpy color or whatever, So I showed up, and this is still when Justin was guiding for you. And he's like, yeah, wrong color. I'm like, you guys said shrimpy. He's like, no, we meant like more like pale kind of with orange. I'm like, so pink? No, he's like, nah. And which is hilarious, right? It's like they eat what you feed them. There are better colors, but he was just so adamant about that, So I'm like, all right. So I go back. And I started thinking about this fly called the Skull Crusher that this guide, Matt McCrary, tied for years. No longer guides, but he's really gifted fly tyer. And it was kind of looked like a, we call them ghost shrimp, but people have weird names from sand shrimp or whatever. They're, kind of translucent, purple, little orange in there and some yellow. So, with that fly, basically, there's nothing new to it, but it's basically a marabou tube. But I definitely wanted some stuff to kind of blend in through there. So whatever you want the body of that fish to be, just choose that as schlappen. Again, if you've seen me on any tying stuff, I don't do dubbing balls anymore. Pointless. Just throw a brush in there. 2 turns on a brush, never comes undone. It's got EP. It's stiffer. It gives you a better shoulder. Or nothing. If you want it to sink more, just do schlappen. And then it was, white. But then the key was that apricot. So that's a new color the last 2 years from Fish Hunter or Nature Spirit now. And that apricot is that perfect sand shrimp color. It's light peach, if you will. And you can put quite a few turns of it. And if you get the blending right, it just looks shrimpy. If you put a bunch of Lady Amherst in there and then some grizzly hackles over the top, even better. It just, I don't really put a lot of flash in those flies. I kind of want them to be invisible, so to speak, and just kind of blend in and kind of have that movement, but not like stand out. Prey doesn't stand out. It's not like, hey, I'm right here, come eat me. It's trying to fit in. So that just goes in with, your stepping style too. So if it's really clear, obviously you can move 5 or 6 steps or something. When it's dirtied up, if I'm not fishing a fly like that, I'll move a little slower. But yeah, it's a good little pattern. My buddy Shane McKay that you're aware of, smoked an absolute chromer out of the lower Squamish like 10 years ago, and all white fly. I think that Mikey tied up. It was just all white. It had some like UV in there, but I'm like, white? Like every time I'm in Canada, or like I should say every time somebody blows my mind on a color, it happens in Canada. Not that it happens all the time. It's happened twice. First time was my buddy David on the Thompson caught and obviously much better steelheader than I at this time. This is probably 10, 15 years ago. Caught like 3 fish behind me on the Thompson. And finally the third one, I'm like, man, what color are you fishing? He's like, red. I was like, dude, what color are you fishing? He's like, I'm fishing red. I'm like, red? Who fishes red? You know? He's like, everybody. I'm like, nobody I know. This is, again, years ago. Just a little red marabou tube. Went home next year, came out, fished with them, had a bunch of red flies. Every single fish I caught on red. Lost my last one. Fished for 3 more days with all the different flies I had. Never got a touch. Now, I'm sure that's some of its luck in there. And maybe the fish weren't around or whatever. But that river specifically kind of changed my game. Came back to Oregon. This is like, I think I'd been guiding 1 year or something. Fished red the entire winter on the Clackamas and hooked something like 27 winter fish myself. And I was just like, oh my God. So I fished red pretty much year round for like 2 years after that. And then I just got bored of it. And now I'm back to, fishing whatever.
I thought red was an American thing. I don't like that's what I've heard red flies down like on all those rivers in Portland and stuff like that. I thought red was a bigger pattern down there. It's interesting that you heard it. You got it on the Thompson up here.
Well, it's been big the last probably 10 years. And I'm not saying, oh yeah, I brought it back with me, because that's not the case. People have been fishing red forever, but like, yeah, there's been a lot more, Instagram posts. I know Marty and Mia fish a lot of red, and they were probably fishing it before me and all the guys on the Sandy. But yeah, you've seen it more.
I'd like to jump across the ocean here for a second, Stu, and talk a little bit more about Iceland, because my wife went to Iceland and she really had a great time and caught some nice fish there. Personally, I've never been. Stu, what type of patterns are you guys fishing over there, and have you utilized your steelhead flies with any success?
The short answer to that is no. No, we started off because the water's fairly cold down there. We'd be using pretty long, when I say pretty long, probably 3-inch long sunrays, stripped. The salmon there really want to chase things, so the faster you can move your fly, the more chance you've got of getting fish.
Stu, would you mind explaining to the people listening what a sunray looks like? Because it is an interesting fly for sure. Okay,
it's just a short tube of some sort. If you can use weighted flies, you can use a weighted tube. A flashy body. Normally, the underwing would be something stiff like bucktail or polar bear. That stops the long wing of monkey or goat that's really mobile from wrapping around your hook. So that's a sunray shadow. It's
a very long, skinny fly, isn't it?
Yeah. Originally, I think before the sunray shadow, the Scottish gillies had a fly called collie dog, which was basically the long hair from the back of a collie dog, just stripped, just whipped onto a hook.
And Stu, what's a big sunray shadow? How long would that be?
20, 30 centimeters.
Oh, wow. So this is a big fly.
Yeah, but in Iceland, we were using things that were probably 10 centimeters at the longest. The majority that we was catching fish on was about 6 centimeters long wing. And then as the season progresses, we was using smaller and smaller. I think the smallest fly I used to get guys into fish was a size 20 treble, which was just basically a bit of fluff.
How do you tie that on?
Very carefully.
So I'm jumping all over the place here, but you brought up a pretty big fly. I got to ask Eric. Eric, what people may or may not know about you is you're not just a steelhead guy. You fish for every species, even species that some might refer to as coarse fish. Would you tell the listeners perhaps some of the more, let's call it, exotic fly target species you've been after in recent years, and maybe how fly design, steelhead fly design has influenced what you're throwing out there?
Yeah, for sure. So Brian's referring to tiger muskie and carp for sure. I mean, we chase smallmouth bass as well. It's kind of a shorter season just because it overlaps into tiger muskie season. And I just not going to do that if I could chase tiger muskie. So yeah, the fly tying aspect of it, it's interesting. When I started out, I was just looking at all the stuff that the guys in the Midwest were doing. So I'm tying giant flies, right? I mean, 14-inch flies and thick, 3 or 4 inches, deep. And my advice to anybody that's getting into a new style of tying, especially the articulated game changer stuff, is tie one and then go put in some water before you tie a dozen? Because I didn't, and that sucked. Maybe 100 flies I tied in a winter on 6/0, hundreds of dollars. None of them fished. They either turned on their sides. I couldn't cast them. They wouldn't sink. They didn't swim right. I mean, you name it. Not one. Not a single one. Not one. So that took a couple years off my life. And so I started to kind of reach out, and, thankfully with the internet, you can just DM people. I'm just like, hey, Blaine Chocolate, how the hell do I do this? And there's a lot of cool people out there, and they'll get back to you. I try to prioritize when people message me through email or mostly social media to always answer back. No gatekeeping here. Let's, always be mixing and matching the information. So between Blaine, Schultze, Mike Schultz, and my buddy Willen, who are all very accomplished kind of warm water and universal fly tyers, they really helped me get better at that and kind of figure out what the missing pieces were. It's so fun to make those flies that it's so addicting. It's the perfect transition from winter steelheading. So all my clients prior to this were from the two-handed world. And once I started getting into it, it was a pretty easy sell. Because I'm like, hey, you know how you don't catch that many steelhead? They're like, yeah. I was like, I've got a second fishery like that. Interested? And they're like, yeah, like, take my money. I'm like, let's go. So one fish in a day is great steelheading. You're going to get that musky fishing. We'll see if this year's different, but like I had 25 or 27 days last year for a season. We never didn't feed a fish. Some days we fed 5. Now, no one catches them. I think we only landed like 15 because everybody trout sets out here. Hey, Rudy, we're good. We're super good on all that licking back there. Yeah, Pop-Pop's doing a thing, okay? Thanks. Dogs, am I right? So, yeah, everybody trout sets, myself included, because you see it. Our waters are crystal clear. You see that fish come out of the tree, and it's 4 feet long, and it's accelerating, and you're just like, oh, my God, it's going to happen. And when they T-bone that thing, nothing's in your head except, here we go. And then I sigh real loud so they hear it. And then I crawl down from the tower, and I just say, I need a minute. I just drink a bottle of water. I usually do another sigh, met with eye contact, and then we get up and we do it again. So over the years, guys have really worked at stripping it hard. Even when you strip set as hard as you can and try to break the rod on that fish's face, you'll see it just slide out. Just 2 5/0 spinnerbait hooks just come right out. Not attached to anything. 50% at least or more of the fish that hit the bag as soon as slack induced flies out. I don't know what their mouths are made out of, Kevlar, tungsten, whatever, but it's so hard to get a hook through there. So the fisheries I fish, it's all sight fishing. You're looking at fish, you're seeing fish. You're probably going to see slow day 8, really good day 50. They're dicks, though. They're not a honest fish. You'll throw it perfect lead, everything, best fly of your life right by it. They won't even blink. You got to work the angles. You got to work kind of the water at certain times of the day. And if you put all that together and you can throw far, this is not your dad's trout fishing. You got to throw at least 50 feet. 80's better, though, with an 11 weight. And, the flies are smaller now. They're like 6 to, 8 inches, maybe 10. And it's an all-day thing. It's full body contact. I mean, you got to bring somebody. If you try to book the day as a single, mandated breaks. And I'm not being funny. Like, if you don't stop casting, I just trolling motor to the middle of the lake away from where we're fishing, and we sit there for 10 minutes and you drink water and tape up your hands or get your life together or whatever, and then we get back in there. But I've hurt people by being so focused and trying to catch a fish. My kind of quote is, people are like, how long are we going to be out here? You either catch a fish, you quit, or it gets dark. Those are the options. And in May and June, that's a long day. So I've done the 12, 13-hour day out there and ruined people's rotator cuffs. Like, this is an exaggeration. Like, people have physical disabilities now because of me. And they still come fishing with me. So, masochist, am I right? I'll touch on the carp thing in a second if you want, but that's basically, if you got any questions about the tiger muskie thing, Brian, there. But you asked about the fly tying. I'll say shortly that it's reversed, meaning as I got more into muskie fishing, that kind of made me think about my steelhead flies, definitely made me think about my bass flies and how they operate. Steelhead, my thing is I'm trying to piss them off. So that's why I enjoy the bass, muskie, and carp, is because they're feeding. They're killing because they're hungry. And that's more interesting to me than killing because they're aggressive. It's like a more mental game. Like, you can piss an alpha male off, right? You just go, what up, short king? Little wang, you get a ladder on the back of your truck, they explode, right? Not hard, right? But to like kind of convince somebody to do something that is more intelligent, and you're like trying to figure out a way to do it, and they're just like seeing right through it. It's more like activated kind of, I don't know, thinking. So when you can kind of relate your fly design into making that fish eat it and seeing it happen, I mean, that's just next level shit right there. It doesn't get better than that. And the top of that is carp. So before I really shut up and let you talk, I used to think this is great. I could take people carp fishing on the flats. They got a Belize trip, a Mexico trip, a Keys trip. Like, oh, they'll get kind of tuned up so they can catch that redfish or that bonefish or that snook or whatever. False. Those are easy to catch. Put it in front of them. They're going to eat it. Bonefish? You mean the saltwater bluegill? Yeah, just put it in front of them without spooking it. They're going to eat it. Put it 4 feet from them. They'll probably eat it. Redfish? My grandma could catch a redfish. Just get it in the water. They're going to eat it. They're going to eat whatever you put in there. They don't care. Unless they're in a tiny pond, then you got to be a little better. Carp, they won't eat anything because they're already 50 feet from you. I mean, you can't talk. If you can't hear me this level, you can't get on the boat. Because if I have to yell down to you at the platform, spooks them. If you point at them, even when they're tailing away from you, it spooks them. I've had guys fart and spook them. Don't move on the boat. You can't move. There's no moving here. You just have to stay completely still. You backcast too aggressive. Oh, you spooked them. Oh, a bird flies over. That spooks them. It got windy for a second. Oh, God, spooks them all. I mean, they are so hard to catch that I think people need to go bone fishing more. Book that redfish trip so when you come carp fishing, you have a shot, because it's not the other way around. So that was the most impressive thing I've seen about carp. Those things are smart, they're social, and they are spooky. I mean, crazy spooky. From all the stuff I've heard, permit are like that. The thing about carp that's better than permit is that if you don't spook them and it gets in their window, they're going to eat it 100% of the time. But that's a very small percentage that it happens. Permit, I've heard, you'll do it, they'll look at it, and then they swim away. The carp don't do that. Maybe 2 refusals and 5 years of guiding them, 4 years, whatever it is now. So you got a good shot if you do it right.
So Eric, I'm just going to jump in here with a quick question. I'm curious to find out if Stu and Scoot have any carp experience. We're going to find that out in a second. But my question to you is this: you're guiding fly fishing for carp. Are you a pioneer in this space, or are there other people doing the same thing?
I mean, I'm not going to sit up in here and be like, look at me, I'm the best ever. No one does it. There's guys that have been chasing carp on the Columbia and other rivers and stuff way longer than I have. Bill Martz up in Washington, I don't know him personally. There's actually a carp clave happening on April 20th, I believe, in Boardman, which is east of Oregon. There's amazing flats out there. So that'll be great to talk to him, doing a presentation out there. There's guys that have been walking, waiting the Columbia forever. John Bartlett, he goes by John Montana. Like 90% of people fish his hybrid fly. He's been doing it for 20 years. There's a lot of people that do it, that they've kept it a really tight secret because it's so cool and no one does it, that it's just like, it's the best time of their life every time they go out. I just started doing it. My buddy Pete Gadd, shout out Pete, got to give him credit. He's always like, you mentioned me, right? Which he's just joking. But if anybody knows Pete, he's awesome. He took me out my first couple times carp fishing, kind of showed me the ropes. That was probably 7, 8 years ago. Then once I got the boat, a client of mine had a pulling platform built for it. Shout out Colin. Thanks, buddy. And I started just basically driving around the Columbia. Now, there's stuff you can find on Google Earth that will help you find those flats. Not a lot of them are walk-in accessible, but it's weird. On the Columbia, there's a lot of places that are really shallow that won't show up on Google Earth, whether it was cloudy that day or I don't know, the bottom changed or whatever. So, it took a long time to figure out a program out of there in as many miles. And hey, if the water's, this low, you go here. It's tidal influenced all the way up there, especially if you go up like from Bonneville down all the way to like where the Kalama is. You know, they're in coastal rivers that go to the ocean. So I'm convinced some of them are anadromous because there's a couple that are, I can see the bay and the water's right there and there's carp. That being said, I don't know anybody else that's guiding out there. Somebody from our shop is going to be guiding there next year, whether it's Brian Colby or Gabe, going to kind of show them the program. There's like maybe 2 or 3 other boats out there that are fishing for them in the same area I am, but they don't have a pulling platform. They're trying to run it through a trolling motor. And it works. I mean, you'll get 1 or 2, but you're going to spook. Like, you basically have to troll in somewhere and put anchor, because if that thing's running and you click the button to turn it off and it makes that beep, guess what? Hey, Rudy, you're having a dream, little one. You're making a lot of noise too. Thanks. That button hitting it off spooks them. And I mean, a lot of time I'm fishing in water that's shallow and you can't run a trolling motor in there. I used to. My boss used to say that I was the only person he knew that would put their Minn Kota in 4 low. So I'm just like crunching it on the bottom. It doesn't work great anymore. But I'm the only person out there I see that has a pulling platform with a push pull. I mean, I'm out there every day in the summer. There was one guy, I put a story up on my Instagram. He was illegally guiding out there. He had a little John boat, total clients in the front. Like, if you guide, you know the look. No stickers on his boat, no guide stickers, no numbers. And I put a post up like, hey, man, I don't care if you're out here. Somebody's going to be out here eventually, but don't come out here with that bullshit. No stickers, illegally guiding. Like, if I see you out there again, I'm coming aboard. Meaning I'm going to pull up and I'm going to ask where your stuff's at. Where's your Coast Guard? I'm going to make your clients feel horrible because they're clients. Be like, yeah, this guy's doing you illegally. If you get busted without a guide license in Oregon, they can take your shit. Meaning your truck, your boat, all your rods, everything you own, gone. That's it. And then you're not allowed to guide for, I don't know, however, maybe forever. Ban your fishing license for a year. It's not worth it. But there's a lot of hoops. You have to have a Coast Guard license to run out there with clients. So a lot of people don't want to do that because it's expensive and takes a lot of time. Long story long, I'm the only person guiding out there, but there's a million people that have done it before me. I'm just trying to have fun and show people something new. And it's, yeah, I mean, all my guys, it's like, I've got texts from them already like, God, I can't wait till the summer, you know? We're all steelheaders, but having those options make it so great. It's like tiger muskie. Hey, you're going to get one, but you're going to work your butt off. Bass, if you get 1 20-inch in a day, that's amazing, but you're probably going to get like 10 to 15, 15 to 18. Carp, like you're going to get 1 to maybe 3, but it could be 20 pounds and you're going to watch it eat. So like the numbers game doesn't come into factor with my client list because we've got our butts kicked for so many years of trying for one fish in the worst conditions ever that the bar is so low that anything above is like, oh, more fish, better weather, more comfortable, and I get to watch them eat. It's like, yeah, I would never want to go from that into like, hey, you want to try throwing a spay rod in the wintertime while it's raining and maybe catch a fish that doesn't want to eat and there's not that many of them? Yeah, so good. So it's lucky the way it played out the other way.
Stu, I've never been to England. I've never been to Europe, but I do know that carp fishing is a big deal over there. Are people fly fishing or is it all conventional tackle?
No, there's people fly fishing. I've done it myself. The way that we target them mainly with the fly in the UK is get dog biscuits, bonios, throw them in. The fish start coming up and eating off the top, and we've got like we tie spun deer hair and cut it up to make it look like a dog biscuit and just flick it out. And you see these big carp come up and just bonk your fly, and then it's like, whoa! Yeah, it's good fun.
How about you, Scoot? You ever do any carp fishing?
I have. I'm Ontario transplant, so it's it's mainly terminal tackle there for carp, and kind of like Stu was describing, but not floating. You basically how we used to do it as kids all the time, and they're super fun. You just basically chum the water. You can use cornmeal or actually just corn. You can go buy a can of corn niblets and chum an area and basically just thread a hook full of corn and cast it out and just wait until one of these things will swim by, and they will eventually pick it up. And they're big in Ontario. They're 30, 40 pounds, and they pull. We used to, my high school was on a river. We fished for them on our spare break in high school. Yeah, so I was pretty fortunate. Carp are awesome. Not quite as romantic as Eric's story and how you fish for them, but Ontario's fun. They pull real strong.
So what I'm hearing is Stu's essentially creating a dog biscuit hatch, and Scoot's creating a feeding frenzy with his corn. Eric, you're not chumming, are you?
Negative. I'm not saying it wouldn't work, but I've never seen a fish eat anything off the surface in the Columbia River. They're just not built for it. That's not where their food's at. So, like, there's rivers in Montana that carp will sip mayflies and back eddies and stuff. You could fish them like a dry fly. There's areas on the Willamette in a certain month that the cottonwoods hatch spring flower, whatever it is, and dump hundreds of thousands of cottonwood seeds on the surface of the river, and it will create foam lines of cottonwood seeds, and the carp will come up and basically graze going through that. And if you throw your fly in the middle, yeah, they get it caught in there. I don't have any interest in that. I think it's cool. I don't want to do it. I've done the, the mulberry hatch with Schulte's crew, which is insane. It's just little purple deer hair things, dry fly fish, and they're eating berries, and they'll just come up and eat those things. Our fish, depending on the bottom they're at. So we've got 3 types of bottom. We've got muddy bottom. We've got a hard packed sand bottom, which looks like you're going to sink in, but it's like concrete. Great to anchor up in. And then we've got like heavy rock, like a freestone. And depending on where you're at in those bottoms, you can fish a different fly. So the mud bottoms, they eat a lot of nymphs. There's a lot of moss in there usually, so they're eating damselfly nymphs. There are hexagenias that happen on the Columbia. Seen them. So those real muddy flats in the early summer, they'll eat a hexagenia hatch or a nymph for sure. And then on the really hard packed bottoms of sand, those are usually where the clams want to be. They can attach there better or whatever. And there's a little foot that comes out, and carp have a cruncher in their throat, like redfish, that just smash and then exits the shell. You know, I've got my finger in there and they've clamped down. People say they've broken fingers doing it. I don't know about that. I don't have tough fingers, but I mean, you can feel the pressure, but you would never do that with a redfish. A redfish will just cigar chopper your shit off. And then my favorite is, and also the worst stuff to pull in, is the kind of softball size rocks, typically in these little micro tailouts. So it's really hard to pull because you want to pull into the current, because the fish are always facing the current, and that way you can sneak up on them. The problem is if it's a rock like this and your push-pull hits it and you're pushing pretty hard because there could be some current, the rock moves and your pull slips. I haven't fallen off the platform yet, but there's been some definite window rolling up. Oh, crap, I'm going in moments, and for whatever reason, I didn't. Really tough. But in those rocky points, 100% crayfish eaters. These are carnivorous, meat pounding. They're the baddest of the bad. Typically, the biggest fish are in there. They're hard to catch because there is current to get that fly presented right. But I love throwing crayfish patterns. They're small. There is some wiggle room in there. I won't get too into it, but we messed around at the end of my season one year with my buddy Zach Vars. He had like a 3.5-inch articulated crawfish, like big, huge rubber or rabbit strip for claws. He's like, I just want to see if one will eat it. I'm like, they're not gonna, but it's your time, whatever. So I pulled them around, just spooking fish. I mean, as soon as they hit the water, same shit happening. Then we kind of got back into this little back area. It was a really heavy rock wall that extended into the water. It was only about 2 feet deep, and there was a fish slowly cruising this rocky edge as it sloped down. And I'm like, he's going to eat it. In my head, but I'm like, I don't know. And Zach's like, what about that one? Typically, we don't throw to any fish that's not tailing. Why? I mean, when they're tailing, they're actively eating. It looks cool. And if you throw to the cruisers, they usually spook. They do a thing that only carp do, is that they swim directly into that fish that you're looking at, run into it physically, and then they both leave. Happens every day in the flats. It's a thing. They tell them, get out of here. They're super smart. They're the Stephen Hawking of fish. I've seen them run into a fish, bail. The fish didn't get the message. Fish came back a second time. Thanks. Hits him again. They both take off. Not fun. So anyways, I'm like, throw it at that fish. He kind of leads it. Strips one. I think the fish spooks because it took off so fast. This thing, 1,000,000 miles an hour, straight to that crayfish, opened its mouth and flattened it against a rock and was like ragdolling it. Figured out it wasn't a fly, spit it, and took off. And I mean, Zach's there just holding the rod, mouth agape. I'm up on the point platform, eyes popping out of my head. It was so quick and aggressive that I didn't even think to say hit him, just no sound. I mean, that fish wanted that crayfish so bad. And so I think there's some room in there to tweak the program to, if I can find those specific fish in that area at the end of a day that we've already caught a couple, we can kind of move into a territory of having something completely different that is even harder.
That's kind of the funny thing with this game, speaking fly fishing in general, is the balance between what is traditionally used for a species, whether it be technique or flies, and innovation. I certainly found, Stu, the limited amount of Atlantic salmon fishing I've done, which was literally a few days on the Humber River in Newfoundland, that the guides there were very attached to certain flies at certain times. And while they were willing to experiment a bit, those experiments weren't very extensive. They were very short, and then we were back to flies that had been used, what I believe, for many decades. Your experience with Atlantic salmon, it goes back much further than your steelhead stuff. How do you find right now in the Atlantic salmon world, whether it's you're guiding in Iceland or fishing in Scotland, are you seeing a lot of innovation with patterns and techniques, or are people still really attached to the traditional stuff? And maybe the traditional stuff is that way because it is better. What do you think?
No, the Atlantic salmon fishing is a bit like steelhead fishing in as far as if there's fish there and there's fresh fish about, they'll more or less take anything. But I think the odds for a normal gilly, because there's so much tradition in the Atlantic salmon world in Scotland, the odds for a gilly is just to keep doing the thing that normally works and just keep doing it for most of the season until a fish finally gives up and it's like, yeah, I'm going to grab it, and grabs it. Having said that, with the amount of travel that goes on now, a lot of people are really good at using sun rays. A lot of good are really good at nymphing with red Francises and other Francis designs and stuff. So people are a lot more open-minded to trying different things and using different techniques and each fly is designed to do a different technique, in the salmon world. So yeah, there's a lot more people who can fish different techniques now. And because of that, the gillies and the guides are being forced into trying new stuff because I know that the clients can do it and the clients have done it in other places.
So I've asked this to other guides, and I'm curious to get your take on it. And Scoot, while you're not a guide, I'm wondering what your opinion on this. So the most common question that a steelhead guide gets in my part of the world is, what do I do when a fish grabs my fly? Scoot, what do you do when a fish grabs your fly, steelhead fishing?
Well, when I'm steelhead fishing, I'm a fan of click pawl reels. So I like the old Hardy reels. So my answer is simple. I wait till they pull, especially if it's on the swing outside of on the first half of the 45. I mean, you don't have to do anything. They're going to grab it and go. It's a little more difficult on the inside if the fish just kind of hops on and it's just there. I'll wait still, and I'll wait. And it seems like an eternity. I guess probably in real time it's 3 or 4 seconds. But if I feel like that fish has climbed on and it's just there and it's not pulling, it's not turned, then I'll side set in towards whichever side of the shore it is and then go from there. But yeah, normally on a grab, I'm waiting, especially with a click pawl. There's not a lot of resistance. So I'm waiting until it's pulling. And then when it pulls, I'm a light set into whichever side facing the bank I am on a side set.
So before Stu and Eric jump in with their answers, I'm going to change the question ever so slightly. So Eric, you're going to go next. I want to know if you're consistent. Do you do the same thing yourself that you would coach your clientele to do steelhead fishing? Or is there a different approach, perhaps, depending on people's level of experience and skill?
Yeah, I would say yes. The last season I worked on the Ron with my buddy Deck. I showed up and we were bullshitting. And I go, hey, man, I got something embarrassing to tell you. And he goes, what? I was like, yeah, I was pre-fishing yesterday and I got smoked and I just wasn't paying attention and I lifted. He's like, you trout set? I was like, yeah. He's like, nice. I was like, yeah. So I haven't done that in many years. So that was real humbling. And he kind of looks around and he goes, you want to know something? I was like, What's up? He's like, I was on the Deschutes with Amy just a couple days before coming out here. He's like, same thing, got ripped, wasn't in the zone, lifted. I'm like, Deck Hogan lifted on a Steelhead. He's like, hey man, we're all not perfect. I was like, very humbling to know. So I would say I've had the talk with my guys. Most of them are real good now, meaning they just know not to do anything. But more importantly, what I've been saying is, when that fish climbs on, just get ready, meaning get ready for what's coming next. Because it could just be pop and you're ready and it doesn't eat it again. And it may eat it before it gets to the hang down, hopefully, or it doesn't. And it's like, let's reassess what to do now. It could smoke you and you're ready, meaning, okay, that fish is going. I don't have to do anything except just lift a little bit, let it take line. Being ready again, fish eats it, run it at you. Just strip as fast as you can. Fuck that reel and just get on it, right? That's the hardest fish to land is when they eat it and come right at you. But if you're ready, you're thinking about what's happening next. I used to just be like, wait till that line comes off the reel. Sometimes it doesn't happen, So just being ready for whatever can happen next is your best approach. And just have, your senses heightened, being in the zone. If you're not, stuff can go wrong. First fish we hooked this season, my buddy Soren gets tugged. I mean, it's popping and it's rolling. I'm like, why isn't it taking line? He looks down, line was wrapped around his reel, snapped 15-pound maxima like it was doll hair. Only fish we saw all day. Luckily, he was out a couple days ago. He just sent me 2 fish he got back to back. So I'm like, way to go, bro. But just being ready in the sense of if you're using a reel with a drag, have it light so it can come out, but don't have it tighter than you would think. When they grab and run, that initial tension is going to set that hook a lot better than having it free spool or really light. I fish click and pawls because I don't care if I land any fish. I just like the way they sound. I'm going to let them go anyways. Just crush it, do a cartwheel, and throw the hook, whatever. I get paid to make people better at spay casting and try to put a fish in the boat. Everybody's fishing a hatch. I mean, that drag system's so dialed that it's so smooth that you don't get the surge you get from click and pawls when you're palming it. Or if you have a reel that just doesn't have a really smooth drag, you're kind of at a disadvantage. Pet peeve, people that palm hatch reels, stop. Are you better than the drag system that's in there with the 40 different layers and the fine tuning? You're going to just put your little palm on there and just get a little breaky. Just stop doing it, man. Just do this. And just, it's going out too quick. Just click. Oh, it's not going out quick enough. Click. This has got to stop. This the palming thing. I'm going to have a bumper sticker. Quit doing that and just have a photo of somebody with a reel because they don't do it good. There's guys that do good. Trey Combs, if you're out there, I'm sure you would palm it just perfectly, but not everybody's Trey Combs or whatever, Scott Howes or anybody. That's awesome.
So, Stu, my question for you is a slightly different one. I want you to answer as these gentlemen did, but I also want to know how this is different than you would approach a take with an Atlantic salmon, or is it different?
I don't think it is actually different. I'd agree with both the guys have just said. I'm going to say now, my last Steelhead trip, I dropped as many fish as I landed. So I'm not on a good run at all at the minute. But usually, if they take on the outside, like Scoot said, they hook themselves. Atlantics are exactly the same. The one thing, I also use click and pull reels myself, so I'm not bothered if I lose fish or not. But I'd agree with, I tend to actually hold my line on the cork as it's swinging so that I can feel the tension. And I can actually feel the tension in the current seam as well while I'm swinging. So I can feel when the actual current's changing, which is usually where the fish are, just so that I don't get caught out that often. But the one thing I would say is if I'm fishing deep, I tend to set the hook as soon as I feel something because the fish has already got the hook in its mouth and it's probably been on for a second or two. If I'm fishing high, I'll wait until I actually feel something before I set the hook.
I heard you say set the hook. That's a controversial subject among steelhead guides. Everyone, I suppose, does set the hook at some point. How long would you instruct a client? And by client, I mean someone who's new to it, Stu. How long would you tell that person to wait to set the hook?
It does depend on the current flow and how the fish has reacted to the fly. I mean, sometimes you see, We know that fish hook themselves at times, it just happens. But the one thing I was conscious of in Iceland this year with clients was we weren't allowed to use weighted flies. So what we were doing was, if we wanted to get deep, we was using fluorocarbon to sink the fly slightly, casting fairly square and putting loads of mends in just to dead drift Francis's down to fish. As soon as you saw that line start to move or tip, we were saying to guys, set the hook, strike. And they wouldn't. And as soon as they start stripping and you're using flies on the surface and they're stripping, and you want them not to do anything until everything goes heavy. And as soon as they saw a fish come, they was like, whack! I was like, no, you're doing this totally wrong. The other way around. It's really, really hard. And it's probably all right for us because we spend a fair amount of our time fishing, probably more so than we should do. These guys might only fish for a week a year. So it's all excitement, and to them they're still getting the excitement out of it, I guess. But if you've worked hard to get somebody onto a fish and they balls it up, it can be a bit frustrating.
So Stu, with coming from an experience as being a client before a guide, which is unique, most guides don't have that perspective. Are you gentle on these folks when they make a mistake, or do you have a way to let them know that they blew it?
No, I'm gentle with them, I think. Having said that, I was much better at the start of the season rather than at the end of the season. At the end of the season, then fish were getting trickier and I was getting tired. I was probably a bit more sharp. But generally, the people aren't doing it on purpose. They want to do the right thing to hook fish. So you try and make sure that they learn from that experience and try and put it in a nice manner so that they get the point. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
So I do have one more question about Iceland. One of my favorite steelhead flies is a pattern of yours called a potbelly pig or steely potbelly pig. I know in a previous episode with Dave on Wet Fly Swing, you described the fly, and I'll certainly put a link to that episode. This is a pattern I fish a ton. And by the way, Stu, when clients send me a message and say, hey, I'm coming to your lodge, what should I tie for flies? This is one of 3 or 4 patterns that I always include the tying directions for them. Luckily, you're an easy guy to find on YouTube, and there's lots of stuff out there with tying directions for that potbelly. I love that fly. It's a great fly. Have you used it in Iceland, and do those Atlantic salmon love it as much as our steelhead do?
I haven't used it in Iceland simply because I think I'd probably get booted off the river and sacked pretty quickly, especially considering that most of the guides have got little size 20 trebles or hitch tubes on. But I know that they work really well in cold water in Norway for salmon because I have a number of people use them in Norway. I've got a number of guys that use them for sea trout fishing. So sea trout are our version of steelhead. They're brown trout that go to sea and come back. Some of the Welsh rivers, which are smallish rivers, get runs of big fish. And when I say big, they might be over 20 pounds. And the way of fishing for them is actually in the dark, nighttime fly fishing. So I've got a couple of friends that use the potbelly pig for that. So it's a pretty diverse pattern. It works for a lot of things.
I know I've got a bunch of them on order from you, and you've got a fairly substantial waiting list right now. Are you taking new orders from people at this point?
I am taking orders because that list never gets any shorter. So if people do want flies, I've just got to wait a long time for them, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, but unfortunately for them.
So before we wrap things up here, and I could talk to you guys for hours, but we're gonna put a bow on this pretty quick. I got a couple of questions, and I'm going to get each of you to weigh in. So the first question is going to be for a new fly tyer who wants to tie a steelhead fly. I'm going to get each of you guys to think about what your best advice to this person might be to start their steelhead fly tying career. The second thing I'm going to get you to tell everyone is if they want to find you, whether it's your Instagram if you have one, or your YouTube, or if you're doing classes, or if there's products that you're attached to that you're selling, how people can find you after this episode. So I'm going to start with you, Stu, just because we're talking right now. So we're looking for a fly tying tip for a new steelheader, and how people track you down on the internet, whether it's buying flies or trying to get on one of your trips.
My advice would be, and Eric said it earlier, it really is, don't sit down and tie loads of one fly in one session, because when you first start, if they're not going right and you do a load of them, you're just going to be wasting your time and a lot of money in materials. I think you're personally much better off tying a fly one day, just looking at it, come back to it the next day, look at it, see if there's anything you'd change, and then tie it again. And before you jump on and do loads of different patterns, make sure that you master one pattern before you start to move on to something else. Because normally with a lot of these patterns, there's different color combinations and different variations, but they're a pattern, that there's a certain style to it. Master that style before you move on to another style. It'll save you a fortune. And you'll also find out what suits your style of fishing, because a lot of fly patterns don't actually fit the way that some people fish.
And how would folks find you online, Stu?
Just Google me. I'm Stuart Foxall Flies on Instagram. I'm on Facebook as well as Stuart Foxall, so you can just grab me on there. I'm very much like Eric. If anybody sends me a question or, they sort of contact me or DM me, I always get back to people. So it might take a day or two, but I always get back to people as and when I get a chance to answer properly. I'll do that.
Excellent. Scoot, you're up next.
So for a beginner learning to tie, I mean, like I agree with everything that Stu said, and mine's kind of the same but different. I think when you're tying, when you're getting to the point where you're kind of like honing in on a pattern, I think an important thing is all these flies have different materials. And I think a good tip is to not move past a specific material into the next one until you're happy with that particular material. So if you've overwrapped a bunch of marabou and you're like, oh, maybe this is too much, maybe it's not, and then you keep going on to the next station, I think when that fly is done, you'll still look back at that piece that you were unhappy with, and it'll kind of drive you nuts. So if you're unhappy with a specific stage in that fly, undo it and do it again. Or if you're getting frustrated, take a break, go for a walk, come back. But really, like on each specific material, make sure you're happy with that wrap or that brush before you move on to your next station. I think that'll save you a lot of grief.
And are people able to track you down? Do you take custom orders, Scoot? What's going on here?
I'm not like these two guys. I have a bit of a love-hate with social media. Look, I love it in the sense that we've got access to everything now, and that's great. I mean, you can look up all these fly tying recipes, and I do it too. Sometimes it drives me nuts with seeing how quickly everything's available. So yeah, I'm not on social media. I've got an Instagram, but I don't really post a lot. But in saying that, if anyone has any questions about anything I've said or any flies or anything I've talked about, they can find my Instagram page at same as my title. It's Craig Scoot Mason, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But I'm not a big poster.
And I would bet if the Squamish River looks good, there's a pretty good chance you're out there.
That's correct.
Right on. Okay, Eric, yourself, please.
Yeah, I would say beginning steelhead flies, 2 would be the fish taco and the hobo spay, just because for the main reason, if you're just getting into tying steelhead flies, you probably haven't been steelhead fishing that long. So those are easy to cast and fish. And you can mix up the color combinations fairly well with them, as well as having some key techniques in there, whether it be, putting dubbing on, palmering guinea, placing flashabou, marabou, ostrich, whatever. But they're not going to cost you a bunch of money to tie. It's on a shank and it's a couple materials. So, and they catch fish. So I'd probably have somebody start there. I was going to say like a rabbit strip, but you can mess those up and they're hard to cast. So start with something like a fish taco or a hobo spay. Like I said, that's pretty much my go-to when people come in the shop. They're like, I need some flies. I'm like, hobo spay, that's your world. Comes in a bunch of different colors. They kind of sink. They're light to cast. They catch fish. Just grab a handful and go. And then, you can explore after that. Stuff coming up. I mean, just check out the shop's website. The new owner, like I said, the shop is Northwest Fly Fishing Outfitters. So if you just go on Instagram, it's NWFFO. And yeah, just if they're looking to find me on Instagram as Mike Hija, that's just MYKIZHA. Funny story. I hate trout. That means trout in Russian, everybody. I had a Russian client tell me that in Alaska, and a single tear rolled down my face because I can't change it now. Yeah, I thought it was cool because that's apparently where the first steelhead was documented, was in Kamchatka, probably on the Japonova or something. They called it Mykesia. I thought it was Russian for steelhead. Probably could have Googled that, probably could have checked that. I didn't, and it means rainbow trout. So that's cool. But that's what I'm under on Instagram. And then you can just check out my website, Fly Fish Portland. It's got blogs on there and a bunch of stuff. But besides that, I guess Friday Night Flies, we do a weekly Friday night tying thing on Instagram, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Used to be about fly tying. Now it's just me. It's on Friday, so it's like most people are getting out of work. And, more so we talk about stuff comes up just randomly and organically, whether it's techniques or something they saw on the river or flies or something. You can't really see anything on Instagram, and I basically tie the same flies every year. It's just flies that I need for guiding, so it's kind of a win-win. But sometimes we'll have like guests on there. Like Willen was on a couple weeks ago. He's hilarious. And my buddy Zach from Portugal the Man came in last year and we messed around tying some stuff. And, it's just a space where if you're sick of scrolling Netflix or you want to see something, I don't want to say it's original by any means, but it was kind of born out of COVID and out of like every fly tying video I've seen. And I'm not dumping on them, but they're all very similar. They're very formulaic, very informative, but this isn't a bad thing. They're broken into pieces where people can learn how to do it. This is not what I do. This is not the show. You're not going to learn anything about fly tying probably, but it's entertaining apparently because we've been doing it for a long time. Yeah, that's basically the whole stick right there. Sometimes I don't want to do it. I'm tired on Fridays. Those usually become the most memorable and,
Guys, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to leave you with this invitation. The concept of In the Bucket is one where we take our guests and we try and get them to come back, kind of like guiding, I guess. And down the road, we'd love to have each of you back. We'll mix up the guests. We'll get you on with some new people. We'll talk about some new stuff. But aside from that, I hope to see you on the river. Eric, you touched on it. We will be seeing you here up on the Skeena for winter steelhead fishing. And hopefully, Stu and Scoot, we get you up sometime again soon. And once again, guys, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time on here and look forward to doing it again. You guys have yourself a wonderful day.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, buddy.
Cheers.
Well, that's the show for today. Once again, I want to thank Eric, Scoot, and Stu for joining me. To the listener, I truly appreciate you tuning in. You can find show notes for this episode, as well as all episodes of In the Bucket podcast online at www.inthebucketpodcast.com. If you want to fish together this summer, you can also find info on our website about joining me, Brian Niska, this August for the Wet Fly Swing and School of Fishing Steelhead Spay School up here on the Skeena at our lodge, Skeena Spay. Until then, I look forward to bringing you our next episode of In the Bucket next month, when I'll be talking with professional guide Trevor Kovich and fly tyer extraordinaire Alex Belanger. I should also mention that if you're on Instagram, you can find us at In the Bucket Podcast. I hope to see you there and look forward to hearing your fish stories.